Hey, Michael, welcome back. And thanks again for joining us for our second segment in our series of returning to work as COVID is hopefully ending. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Great. So let me start this off with a question that I'm kind of fielding from a lot of people in the market. I'm seeing a fair amount of friction between senior leadership who wants to see people back in the office as much as possible. And on the other hand, employees that want the hybrid structure and being able to work from home a number of days per week. How do you manage this friction if you're the person that wants to be working from home in a hybrid structure?
It's obviously something that every single company is dealing with. And if you even look, I mean, we're doing this recording at the very end of June, just getting into July. Even the last week, there's announcements from Uber, from tech companies. Every company is handling this differently. So this is obviously going to be an ongoing and evolving topic. If you're the person that's hoping to remain remote, the single biggest thing you can do is demonstrate the extreme amount of value that you still bring to your job or to the team from a distance. And now I know that sounds like, well, of course you should do that thing. But what's going to happen now as we all transition back to some of us being live is there's going to be easier ways, more friction-free ways to accomplish a lot of things. That doesn't mean, though, by the way, that you can't, in your own way, find ways to be extra useful from a distance. So I'll give you one specific example. At the ends of meetings, very often people leave a meeting. Okay, great. That was awesome, Melissa. You're out the door, on to the next thing. And no one actually necessarily collated or collected what was going to be done as well as possible. Now, we all know we should be very thorough with next steps, but that doesn't always happen. If you're remote, however, one of the advantages you have is very often you can be doing really comprehensive work in culling together what has been happening in that conversation. And then with very quick turnaround, providing that in written form to people in some way. One small note about that, make sure your subject lines on your emails are extensive and accurate to aid in searchability, to make sure people know what email they're opening and why. So get rid of subject lines like checking in, yesterday's meeting, this morning's conversation, touching base, none of that stuff because it's confusing and it's very difficult to search for the email. So it's one little tip to demonstrate that you can still do your job very effectively at a distance.
I like that. I'm not the best at creating on-point subject lines, but I'm trying to be better at that. For our next question, I was curious to cover the notion of how do you create a sales strategy that includes both in-person and video? A lot of people are speculating that there won't be as much business travel going forward, i.e. I suspect we won't be flying across the country for a 1-hour meeting unless it's a really important meeting. More business will likely be conducted over video than it did historically, but clearly not all business. So how do you decide or delineate when you should be in person and when you shouldn't? What's acceptable to make sure you're winning as much business as possible?
This is a question that I think we're all going to be grappling with. And I think it's a smart question. I'll tell you why, because even the people who really have their finger on the pulse of what's going to change in our society, they're trying to figure it out and they might be right or wrong. I coach a dean at a well-respected business school. This person happens to think that our society has changed permanently by a factor of 25%.
Wow.
25% of business travel that used to happen won't. 25% of food and beverage that used to be delivered in this way won't. 25% of communication that used to be primarily written won't. That every facet of our society will in some way shift by about 25%, which is a massive change. Now, this person might be right or wrong, but this person obviously has their finger on the pulse even more than you or I do, or any of the people probably listening to this, about what the business environment is going to look like in the coming years and decades. So it's going to be different. A few things you can do here. One, try to lean into the advantages that both of these things give and try to take some command, even if it's not totally truthful. I don't mean lie in any way, but I mean position things in a positive manner for the client. So that might sound like, hey, I'm probably going to be able to squeeze one in-person visit in the next few weeks. I'm so excited about that. When is that going to be most convenient for you? Now, that's if you have a flexible calendar. So in that situation, what you're doing is you realize you only get one of these, but now you're spinning it as a positive for the client and they get to choose when. Now, on the flip side, let's say you have to cram all these into fewer trips because you're not going to fly as much. Then that might sound something like, hey, I'm going to be in your neck of the woods this time. Is there any way we can prioritize our in-person meeting for this thing? I'm so excited to get to connect face to face. So in other words, you're positioning some of these limitations as positives. That's one approach. The other is that some of these decisions are going to be company by company and budget specific very much. So to the extent that you can make these limitations, not so much things that the client has to deal with, but rather things that you determine on the back end, that's part of now the job of client management. And if you're also transparent for the client about what makes their life better, so that you name transparently that they might have some benefit from being remote too, they might therefore give you the same level of freedom to be remote as well. That can sound different for each client relationship, but that can be making sure you build things into their time zone, asking gently where they'll be dialing in from, maybe even building a little tiny bit of rapport based on where they are in the world. These are all ways to make the relationship deeper, even though you may spend less time face to face.
So let me ask you this question, Michael. Would it be appropriate to ask a prospective client whether or not you're advantaged by coming in person? Because the worst scenario is you don't recognize you really would have a better chance of winning if you actually went in person, and maybe you misread the situation and decided to do it over video and you lost a big opportunity because of it. Is that awkward to ask that question, or does that work in your favor?
I think the first step here is everyone, you're probably more likely to win the business in person. You probably are.
Fair enough.
That's not true for everybody. I mean, some people might be really not very skilled salespeople or business developers in the room. So that's a different thing. But if you're just looking baseline to baseline, apples to apples, humans tend to have much more information to make a decision when they're face to face. And they also, by the way, might feel a higher degree of reciprocity. So even if you lose the business, you're probably more likely to keep the relationship and have the advantage of feedback or an ongoing relationship. So it's probably better to be in person. Let's just be blunt about that. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you can't win business remotely. And to your point, can you just explicitly ask the client? I would say yes, but there's some conditions with this.
Okay.
Yes, but it depends on that client and how they like to communicate. So the example here is some clients might be fine with, if you and I have a pretty long historic relationship, I might say, look, Melissa, I'm just going to ask this bluntly. Feel free to say no, but would it make a difference if I'm there in person? Is that going to help us, get across the finish line? Now, maybe that's a relationship you have. For others, that might be way too salesy. If that seems too direct and a little bit mercenary even, then you can get that same information, but do it in a much more roundabout manner. So that might sound like one of the great things about now having the possibility of being in person. If you have everything you need to make a decision and you just want to leave it at that, that's fine. But I also know I actually can travel now, which is great. I'm fully vaccinated, and I'm frankly looking forward to travel a little bit. Would it make a difference for you if we could actually have a sit-down meeting and walk through this together? Is that going to be an important factor in how you make this decision? So I'm asking the same thing. If you hear it, I'm just being much more nuanced with how I frame the language for that particular client.
I think that's fantastic. So my last question is, if you're going to be remote for a meeting that would historically have been in person, how can you do all these essentials around selling, reading body language, understanding if what you're saying is resonating with the prospective client, asking for the business at the end, creating rapport, all those things that we can do in person that are harder to do when you're over video?
Sure. The first lesson is, folks, don't throw out all the stuff that you've learned over the last 15 months. At some point, you probably realized, wow, like if I hold up a Post-it note on the camera and then I show that I'm writing something down, it builds a little tiny bond. I don't know why that is, but it does. Well, yeah, it does, because what you're doing in that moment is you're reminding the person that you are a three-dimensional being living in a three-dimensional space with actual Post-it notes. So everything over the last period of the year that you have tried to build to your advantage and take advantage of being in this remote thing, keep that. So if that's like you walk over, you grab a prototype, if you're in a manufacturing business, if you do a screen share to walk them through some material that you would actually have a harder time pulling together quickly because you're referencing multiple links, then do that. So use all those same things that you have. Now, when it gets to the things that you just simply cannot do as well at a distance as you could in the room, like reading body language, the single best thing you can do is call those things out in a gentle and transparent way. So for instance, if you're talking to someone and they're just on audio and they're for whatever reason not coming on camera, even though you've maybe asked them to do so, very gently, you can hint at that by saying, if we were in the same room, or if I could show you what I'm doing right now. You don't have to make them come on camera. No one likes to be called out necessarily, but you can name the fact that there are some limitations, but work your way around them. Almost like treat it like a friendship that is now someone else is across an ocean somewhere. And you can think of the colloquial version of this of like, if I were in the room with you right now, I would throw my arms around you. Now, you're not going to say that to a client, of course.
Why not?
But no, of course not. But if you can say these things, so you're tacitly naming for them, this is different. And yet, even because of this distance, I would still try to do these things. If you're showing that you would be going above and beyond, even with this real separation of not time, but certainly space, that's going to go a long way to building rapport. And the final thing you asked about, which was closing the business, just practice asking important questions when you're remote. And if you need to do any of the drills that your clients and the people getting this information might be familiar from things I've taught in the past, like if you need to walk your fingers across your desk like that, down here though, so no one sees it, to make sure you ask the question, and at the end, you can draw a question mark on your desk. They can't see you're doing that, to force yourself to stop talking, live with that silence, wait for them to respond, then you should do that. Get accustomed to asking those important questions, doing so with linguistic precision, with a calm, relaxed demeanor, and with silence at the end so the person can actually respond.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Michael. I appreciate it.